Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Reefs Go Live. My name is Bella, and I'll be your topside host for today. We are so excited to have you here with us today for our second episode, Superheroes of the Caribbean Reef. We're sitting here at Cumbers, enjoying the sunshine, but beneath the surface is a high-stakes environment where every animal has a specific critical role to play. Each species has its own superpower. The coral, the damselfish, the parrotfish, and the sharks, they all have a special role to play to help keep the reef alive and healthy. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. But before we head underwater, I'd like to welcome some of the schools here today. Thank you guys so much for making the time and joining us live here today. It's great to have you all here with us. Remember, this is a live broadcast, so you can put your questions in the chat at any time and we'll be sure to answer them. Before we head underwater, I should say it's not just me making this live broadcast today. We have a whole team of production crew behind the scenes that are making it possible to have this live broadcast. Before we head, and now let's head underwater, Anna, would you like to say a quick hello?
Hi everyone, my name is Anna, and I'm going to be your underwater host for today's Reefs Go Live episode. Welcome back to the reef. Take a look around. It might seem very quiet and peaceful, but these reefs are absolutely full of life. If I'm looking around, I can see some triggerfish over here, some butterfly fish swimming around. I can see a sergeant major, stoplight parrotfish, and every single species of fish, every piece of coral, even the tiny little creatures which live buried underneath the reef, they all have their own specific role to play on the reef. And when we're talking about an ecosystem, we refer to these roles as ecological niches. Something I hope some of you might remember from our last episode. Now, some of these species are so important that if they were to disappear, the reef would change completely. We call these keystone species, and they are the true superheroes of an ecosystem. So, here on the coral reef, we don't just have one keystone species. There are so many different species which are all needed to help keep the system in balance. We have our builders, we have our gardeners, we have our recyclers, and we have our predators. So let's start with our builders. Everything that you can see around me was made by a single type of builder, and that is our coral. So let's take a little bit of a closer look. Can you see all of these small holes over here? Each one of them is a coral polyp. And together, thousands of these coral polyps will form coral colonies, which make up the structure of our reef ecosystems. But here's where it gets really interesting. Inside the living tissue of each of these polyps, we have microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae, they will produce their own energy from the sun in a process called photosynthesis. And the corals themselves will get 95% of their energy from these tiny little partners.
Thanks for that, Anna. Quick shout out to Mrs. Stone's grade first class in Lakewood, Colorado, and Greg Locker in North Carolina. Thanks for joining us for our broadcast today. So what's really cool is that it isn't just one organism working alone. The scientists call this partnership between the coral and the algae a symbiotic relationship where each species is helping each other out. So the algae called zooxanthellae that lives inside the polyp of the coral provides the coral with its energy, and in return, the coral provides the algae with shelter, a place to live. And it's only because these two organisms are working together that they're able to build massive structures of the reef and provide home for thousands of other fishes and protect the coastlines. This is why we call them the builders. But every ecosystem needs more than just the builders. It needs a gardening team. Anna, can you tell us a bit about the fish that are keeping the reefs clean?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question, because we have so many different species which fulfill different roles across the reef. We're going to start off by looking at one of the most important, the herbivores, or as we like to call them, the gardeners. These are fish that eat the algae, which is that fuzzy green and brown stuff that you often see growing in certain areas of the reef. But before we get into that, can you guys name any herbivorous reef fish species? So, if you come over here, you're going to see this thin, slightly fuzzy layer covering all of these rocks. This is the algae. And this stuff grows really fast, so it can very quickly take over and start to smother the coral colonies. That's where the herbivores come in. They're constantly grazing, gardening the reef and making sure that the coral has the space which it needs to grow. So let's have a quick look around now and see if we can spot any gardeners. It can be a little bit difficult to see sometimes because they're very small and vast. But we do have some damselfish down here that's doing a little bit of gardening, swimming around its small patch. So that's pretty cool to see. But Bella, why don't you tell us a little bit more about some of the specific fish which do this gardening job?
Of course, Anna. So some of you guys were right in the chat. Parrotfish and surgeonfish are both great examples of herbivores that we see on the reef. We're going to talk a little bit about our groupers in a little bit. So two examples of fishes that we see out here on the reef that are also herbivores are damselfish and our surgeonfish. Like the damselfish that Anna just saw, these guys are much smaller, but they're incredibly territorial. Instead of roaming the reef, damselfish will claim one specific patch of the reef and they'll defend it against any intruders. Even bigger fish or divers, or like you can see in the video, they'll attack the turtle and defend their territory from the turtles. They actually weed their territory, picking out the algae that they don't want in that area and making space for their preferred food to grow. We also have the surgeonfish. These are another important of our herbivore species out on the reef, and they're like the roaming mowers of the reef. They go out in big groups grazing on the reef, keeping the coral clean. They actually get their name from a little scalpel on their tail, which is as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, which is why we call them surgeonfish. This is their built-in defense weapon that they use while they're working. By defending these patches of reef, they completely change the landscape of the reef. It's a constant battle for space down there. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about why the herbivores are so important to our reefs?
Yeah, and when the herbivores are doing their job well, the algae is kept nice and under control, and all of the coral has the space which it needs to grow. But if herbivore numbers start to decline, for instance, due to overfishing, things can change very quickly. So what do you think? If we start to lose our herbivores, is this algae cover going to increase or decrease? If you said increase, then you would be correct. The algae will very quickly take over and outcompete the coral for space and for light. So even though all of these herbivores might seem small, they play a really important role on the reef. And it's not just the fishes. Here in the Caribbean, we have sea urchins, which are really important for controlling how much algae we have growing on our reefs. And in the 1980s, we actually had a massive die-off of our urchin populations. And that caused our reefs to stop being quite so healthy, because the algae started to grow and a lot of the coral started to die. But luckily, now, we're starting to see those urchin populations increase again, which is really good news for keeping our reefs nice and healthy.
Thanks, Anna. So another couple shout outs to Kim Hose and for my mom for tuning in with us today. Thank you guys for being here with us. So another important group that helps to keep the reef healthy are the recyclers. These guys are important because they help to recycle nutrients and reshape the reef itself. Now this group might surprise you a little bit because they're not just eating the algae, they're actually eating the coral itself. We call the fish that eat the coral corallivores. At first, eating coral might sound like bad news for the coral reef, but like a lot of things in nature, it's not quite that simple. Some level of coral grazing is completely normal, and in small amounts, it can even be helpful to the reef's health. Anna, can you see any of that happening down there?
Yeah, and if you can see any fish picking at the coral on the reef around me, those are our corallivores. So, if we take a look, we can see some parrotfish. And we also have animals like the butterfly fish and the wrasse. And they are actually eating the living tissue which covers the coral. And that might sound bad at first, but the coral is actually very good at recovering. It can regrow its tissue after a small amount of grazing. And in fact, it can be good for the coral, because these corallivores will eat damaged tissue and tiny parasites that would otherwise spread to cover the entire coral. So although it might sound quite destructive at first, it's actually just a natural part of how a healthy reef works. But there's one species that takes this a step further, and is actually really important for recycling nutrients in our ecosystem. Bella?
That's right, the parrotfish. These guys are particularly interesting. So when parrotfish scrape algae, they grind at bits of the coral's surfaces, and they grind bits of the coral's calcium carbonate skeleton. So this material passes through their digestive system, and when they poop, it comes out as sand.
What? So you're telling me that all of this sand that I can see around me is actually parrotfish pee? So not only are these species feeding and recycling the nutrients, they're also helping to form our beaches and our underwater habitats. So now we've looked at our builders, we've looked at our gardeners, and we've looked at our recyclers. three of the key groups which help to make our coral reefs stay healthy. But these roles don't just exist on their own. They're all connected through something called the food web. So let's take a bit of a closer look at how that works.
Energy on the reef starts with the sun. Tiny organisms like algae use sunlight to grow. This algae becomes food for lots of small animals. Larger herbivores, like parrotfish, graze on it too. The smaller animals are eaten by larger fish, and at the top are predators, which help keep populations balanced. All of these feeding relationships connect together to form a food web. If one part of the web is removed, it can affect everything else. That's why every species, from tiny algae to top predators, plays an important role in keeping the reef healthy.
All right, so we have a question coming in from Greg. With the warming of the ocean and increasing amounts of algae, will the reef be able to support the increase in parrotfish? This is a great question and something that we're trying to understand at CCMI. So, extremely large numbers of large parrotfish, such as bumphead parrotfish, can cause damage to the reef. But in general, herbivores are beneficial to the reef unless they're in extreme numbers. So we could be looking at a trophic cascade situation, which we're going to talk about shortly. So as you just saw in that video, everything on the reef is interconnected. And one important part of that system are the predators. Predators are the fish that eat other animals. And we call the predators that eat only animals the carnivores. And we call predators that eat both plants and animals the omnivores. I think Anna just found a predator, so let's cut back to her and see what she's found.
Here comes one right now! Look at this absolutely massive barracuda just swimming along beside us. That's a pretty unexpected guest to have here. Amazing. So some of the other predators that we get here in the Cayman Islands are things like groupers, snapper, and sometimes if we're really lucky, we might get to see a shark cruising by on the reef. And these predators have a really important role. They help to prevent any single species from becoming too dominant on the reef. For example, many predators will feed on animals, which hide in all of the small cracks and crevices on the reef. And in this way, they help to make sure that the whole system remains nice and balanced.
Exactly. And because everything is connected through the food web, changes at one level can affect everything else. So if the predators are removed, often through overfishing, we can get too many of the mid-level fish, which then eat large numbers of the smaller fish. And that can lead to what scientists call a trophic cascade, where changes at one level of the food chain ripple through the whole ecosystem.
So what do you think would happen if we lost all of our predators? We would really love to hear your thoughts, so I'm going to give you a minute to put them into the chat. Really think about everything that we've spoken about today. We've learned about our four main roles: our builders, our gardeners, our recyclers, and now our predators. If that role were to suddenly disappear, what would happen? And while you're thinking, here's a little French angelfish swimming by.
Cool angelfish, Anna. I love those guys. This is why biodiversity is so important on our coral reefs. These superheroes aren't invincible on their own. When lots of different species perform similar roles, like multiple gardeners or predators, the ecosystem becomes more resilient. If one species of, let's say, herbivores declines, then another can sometimes fill that role. It's a bit like a team with backup players. If one player isn't there, another player can step in and save the day. But if nobody can play that role at all, then the whole team starts to struggle.
Yeah, and right now, one of the biggest threats to coral reefs in the Caribbean is stony coral tissue loss disease, or Skittle D for short. This is a disease that actually kills the tissue of the coral, causing it to die, peel away, and then exposing the coral skeleton underneath. Once it arrives on a reef, it will spread incredibly quickly, as it can infect over 25 species of stony corals, which are these corals with hard skeletons that create the structure of the reef. It was first found in Florida in 2014 and then spread very quickly across the whole of the Caribbean. It got to Grand Cayman in around 2020, and then last year in the summer of 2025, it arrived here in Little Cayman. And in general, coral disease is increasingly becoming an issue on the coral reefs here in the Caribbean, and something that we're having to try really hard to combat.
I see some answers coming in from our last question. You guys are exactly right. If we lost predators, there would be less little fish because there would be more medium fish. That's right. And without predators, this would outgrow food supplies, leading to disease and death. Thank you guys for your answers. It's great to see that you guys are thinking through these really complicated questions that are happening on the reef all around us. So because corals form the foundation of the reef, as Anna already mentioned, when their tissue dies from disease, it will overgrow with algae and the structure will start to break down. This reduces shelter for fish and limits food for species that depend on coral. It also disrupts the nutrient balance, that affects the entire ecosystem. That's why scientists are working hard to understand and manage this disease and others. So when corals are put under pressure like this, it becomes even more important that the reef ecosystem is in balance. But it's not just the animals living out on the reef that are impacted by the corals. You and me, we're both impacted by corals and how they're doing. Coral reefs are critical to our well-being and are very important, especially in island communities like the Cayman Islands. Coral reefs are crucial to our society. They provide us food, they also support things like tourism and fisheries, and they protect our coastlines from storms by buffering wave energy.
Yes, and scientists are working really hard to help conserve our coral reefs. One of the ways that we do that here at CCMI is for our coral nursery, and I have a mini example here to show you. So we have much bigger versions of these frames, and we take coral fragments like these, put them onto the nursery, and then monitor them as they grow, monitor their health, and once they get big enough, we can then transplant them back out onto the reef. And one of the things that we're really looking at is which types of the same species are more resilient to warming waters and more resilient to coral disease. So when we're growing them on the nursery, we're trying to make sure that we have the types which are going to be able to cope better in the future with these greater pressures on our reefs.
Thanks, Anna. That's why our nurseries are so important to us. Shout out to Geddes Hislop joining us from the Cayman Turtle Center. So just before we finish, do you guys have any questions for us? Put your questions in the chat, and while we're waiting for your questions, let's look at some of the things that we've seen on our dive today. So today, we learned that everything on the reef is connected and that fish are much more than just animals swimming around the reef. They're the builders that are creating the structure of the reef. They're the gardeners that are controlling the algae, the recyclers that are producing sand and nutrients, and predators that are balancing the food web. So today we saw barracuda, we saw angelfish, we saw damselfish, and lots of coral. And it's only together that all of these species are able to help keep the coral reefs healthy, productive, and resilient. So let's see some of your questions. All right, I have a question from Doug. How much Skittle D are you seeing in Little Cayman? That's a really good question and something that's important right now to us. The Department of Environment are closely monitoring the spread, and although it's not completely around the whole island in Little Cayman, from survey data, it appears that it's present on over half of the reefs in Little Cayman. All right. I also see a question about how much sand can one parrotfish produce. That's a really good question. And it's estimated that one large parrotfish can produce 1,000 pounds, which is equal to 450 kilograms of sand per year. That's a lot of sand, and if you were to weigh it, that would be equal to one baby grand piano. So, great question. I also see another one. What is something that we can do to help reef biodiversity? That's a really great question and something that's really important for us to think about, especially because our reefs are so important to our well-being. So something that you can do at home is to eat sustainable seafood, know where the fish that you're eating is coming from. Eating lionfish is a great example because they're an invasive species. Another thing that you can do is reduce your single plastic use and use public transportation or bike around. And be mindful of your snorkeling and diving. Enjoy the marine environment, but try not to kick the corals and break them up. I also see a question, does the barracuda that Anna saw eat other fish? Well, barracudas are one of our predator species that we find out on the reef, so they eat lots of those mid-level fish that we find on the reef, and they're important for keeping balance in the ecosystem. So now, unfortunately, we've run out of time for today's episode, so we haven't got time to get through all of your questions, but we'll be sure to answer those in the chat. For now, it's goodbye from me and our crew up here on the surface. But before we go, Anna, would you like to say a quick goodbye from the reef?
Alright guys, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I've had a blast showing you around the reefs here at Cumbers. And I really hope to see you all again for the third episode, which is From Ridge to Reef, and which will be airing on the 8th of March. Bye!